Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Japanese-style milk bread. That's right, if this was the white bread we all grew up eating, the term white bread would not be used to describe things that were dull, bland, and uninspired, since this amazing loaf of bread is the opposite of all those things. Plus, it is relatively easy to make, and actually stays fresher and softer longer than your typical loaf of homemade bread. And that's all due to how we're going to start this recipe, which will involve combining some bread flour with some whole milk and some water in this small saucepan. And once all that's in there, we'll take a whisk and mix this until very smooth. And in a milk bread recipe, this is referred to as the starter, or some people actually refer to it as the roux, R-O-U-X. And what we'll do is place that over medium-low heat, and we'll cook it stirring often until it gets very thick and reaches a temperature of at least 150 degrees, which will be pretty much right before it starts to simmer. And no, I don't actually use a thermometer. I just cook it until it's thick and it seems like it's just about to bubble. But if you want to double check with one, go ahead. I mean, you are after all the disco stew of your milk-based roux. But as long as yours ends up looking like this, you should be fine. And because things like this tend to get stuck in a whisk, I went ahead and changed to a spatula. But anyway, like I said, we'll go ahead and cook that over medium-low until it gets nice and thick and hot. At which point we'll pull that off the heat and transfer it into a measuring cup, since we are going to need exactly 1/2 cup, which, if everything goes according to plan, is exactly how much our starter ingredients will make. And that's it. We will simply let that cool all the way down to room temp before we use it. Okay, that's one of the big keys here, so don't rush it. And that's it. Once what we're calling a starter is cooled all the way, we can move on to making the actual dough. And for that, we'll need some bread flour, which we'll add to the bowl of our stand mixer, followed by the aforementioned cooled roux. And because we're adding what's called a gelatinized starch, which is basically starch that has water permanently trapped inside it, that is not only going to keep our loaf nice and moist, it's also going to help keep it fresher and softer longer, if we can get it off our finger. There we go. And then besides that, we'll also add some salt and some sugar, and of course some dry active yeast, followed by some warm but not too hot milk. Okay, like 110 degrees is perfect, as well as 1 beaten egg. And then what we'll do is start kneading this with our dough hook attachment on low speed for about 5 minutes or so. And I didn't film it, but as usual, while you do this, don't be afraid to turn off the machine and take your spatula and scrape down the sides. And then what we'll do after kneading for about 5 minutes, or whenever our dough looks a little something like this, is we will stop and scrape that dough off the hook. That's right, this dough is going to be off the hook, which I've edited since it took me way too long. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and toss in our last ingredient, which is a generous amount of cut up room temperature butter. Okay, not cold and hard or super soft, just simply room temp and somewhat malleable. And then what we'll do is continue to knead on low speed for another maybe 10 to 12 minutes. And I should mention that butter's going to take a few minutes to get incorporated. So don't get nervous, just keep kneading. And also don't be afraid to stop this once in a while and scrape down the sides. But anyway, like I said, we'll knead that for about 10 to 12 minutes until we have a slightly tacky but very smooth and very elastic dough. Okay, we should be able to pull on it and it should stretch out without breaking right away. Right, if that dough just tears off in your hand, it has to knead a little longer. But this was looking and feeling good. So we'll go ahead and remove that from the stand mixer. And we'll remove that from the bowl and attempt to shape it into a nice smooth ball, which is pretty easy to do if you rotate that dough between your two hands like this. And that's it. We'll go ahead and transfer that into a lightly buttered bowl and then cover it and let it rise in a warm spot for about an hour to an hour and a half, or until just about doubled in size. Oh, and while our dough is rising, what we'll do is very, very generously butter a 9x5 loaf pan. Okay, if you're not thinking you maybe put too much, you probably didn't put enough. So don't be shy with the butter. And then let me show you what our dough should look like when it's perfect. Okay, if we poke it with our finger, it will pretty much hold that shape perfectly and maybe deflate a little bit. All right, if you poke it and it completely deflates like a pop balloon, then it rose too much. Or if you poke it and the dough springs back and fills the hole, that would be underrisen. So what I'm trying to say is this is perfect. And then what we'll do is transfer it onto our work surface, and we will press and knead out all the air. At which point we're going to press and shape this into some sort of rectangle that's exactly the same width as the length of our loaf pan. In other words, something 9 inches wide. And feel free to use a rolling pin if you want. but I'm just going to do it by pressing and stretching with my hands. Which reminds me, you probably don't need any flour here. Right, this dough has a lot of butter in it, which besides making it very delicious, also makes it very easy to work with. But anyway, once we have that shaped into a rectangle about 9 inches wide, which of course we can always check with our loaf pan, we will go ahead and roll that up and shape that into as uniform a log as possible. Oh, and one little mistake I made here. The surface I'm pressing facing up is the smoother surface, so I probably should have flipped that over before rolling, since the surface underneath was a little more irregular. But having said that, once it's baked, it looked fine. So now I'm wondering why I even mentioned it. And then what we'll do once we're happy with that is transfer it into our loaf pan with the seam side down. And we'll give that a little bit of a pressing to make sure it's evenly distributed. At which point I'm going to reuse that foil and cover this up. And then we'll let this dough rise in the pan for about 35 to 45 minutes. Or until it rises just about up to the top edge of the pan. So that's looking just about right. And then before this goes in the oven, we will lightly brush the top of our loaf with some milk. And see here how I'm using too much, and it's running down into the bottom of the pan. Try not to do that. Okay, we basically just want to lightly coat the surface. And that's it once our loaf's been milked. That is now ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about 35 minutes, or until the top is golden brown and it's beautifully puffed up, and hopefully looks a little something like this. Oh yeah, now that is gorgeous. And I'll give this a spin for a little 360-degree viewing. And yes, it's just as beautiful from every angle. And at this point, what we need to do is let this rest for exactly 10 minutes in the pan before very, very carefully removing it to a rack to cool, as in all the way down to room temp and not still warm before we cut it. Okay, a warm slice of bread is tempting, but if you cut it now, you're going to lose moisture, so we'll let it cool down before we slice it. And then if you want a warm slice, you can use a little invention we call the toaster. So yes, I did indeed let mine cool all the way down before slicing in to reveal an absolutely perfect crumb. Oh, and before I cut another slice and go in for the official taste, I have to mention I took an end piece like this on a test loaf, and we made some chocolate chip bread pudding with it. And it was, to quote Michelle, the best bread pudding we've ever had. So just something to keep in mind. But anyway, let me go ahead and cut and butter a slice so I can do the official taste test. And that, my friends, really is the best white bread ever. Just so amazingly light and soft, plus what I think is the perfect amount of sweetness. And the main difference between this and your typical white bread, besides that highly scientific starter we began the recipe with, is that this bread has a much higher fat content, thanks to all that butter we kneaded in. And I think you're going to be very impressed with just how big a difference that makes. So you almost don't need to spread any more butter on it, but please do anyway for the full experience. And then speaking of experiences, besides enjoying it as is, this would be perfect for our Japanese-style egg salad, which hopefully you've seen our video for. But if you don't want to enjoy this untoasted with a tamago sando, then by all means toast it, and enjoy maybe the world's best tuna sandwich. So there really is no shortage of options. Since as easy as this bread is to make, what's even easier is figuring out how to use it. Which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.